So today I was supposed to be somewhere in the Caribbean in my family vacation until Sue Ellen invited me, and I'm delighted to be here and to be with you. And so the story of the book and the central message of the book is that power is no longer what it used to be. You know, and it just takes reading the newspapers or watching the daily news to know that power is shifting. That power is moving from west to east, from north to south, from presidential palaces to public squares, from very large corporations to startups that sometimes displace them, and even in some places, even from men to women. Not as much and as fast as some of us would like it, but it's happening. So power is shifting. We know that there's no surprise in that. And it's changing the world. But I believe that there is a more defining trend in today's world, and that is not that power is shifting, but that power is decaying. That those that have power can do less with it than their predecessors, that they are more constrained, and they are more transient. That power has become more fleeting, that power has also become easier to acquire. But as Sue Ellen said, it's much harder to wield, and it's harder to keep. Moreover, I argue, and I think there's plenty of data to support that argument, that this is happening everywhere. This is not just a United States phenomenon or a rich country phenomenon or a poor country or a Western or Asian. This is happening globally. And it's not just happening to countries. It's happening to religions. And it's happening to cultural institutions and to museums and to universities and to big corporations and to armies and to every human endeavor. Look for some sort of organized human endeavor, and you will see that those that run it are more constrained than ever in doing what they always do, and that they always took for granted. I am not arguing, nor I will ever argue, that there are not a lot of very powerful centers, very powerful individuals, very powerful corporations. Of course, the CEOs of the big banks and the big multinationals and the president of China, of Russia, of the United States are very powerful people. But I will argue that they have more constraints in what they can do with the power they have. And I would argue that that is changing the world in very profound ways. And that in a lot of examples on your daily lives and in what's going on in the world are manifestations of these trends. As I was writing this book, it took me like 7 years to write, and not just because I'm a slow writer, but I'm a very insecure writer. And I was very aware of two things. First, that power is a big subject that a lot of very, very smart people have touched upon over centuries. And so when I stood there looking at my blank screen, I was asking, myself, you're probably an idiot, because what can you say about power that has not already been said? But then I dared give it a try. And the other thing that I was very aware is that what I was going to say about power ran against the grain and against the dominant narrative about power these days, which is that power is more concentrated, that there is a bunch of plutocrats and very powerful individuals and Wall Street financiers and Googles of the world and the Putins of the world and the Chinese Communist Party in the world that are wielding and holding and concentrating power. And so how can I come and just say that the contrary is the trend? So my only hope was to rely on data and on the best social science that I could discover and use. And that's what I did. And therefore, the book is organized in chapters that show the evidence, the numbers, the statistics, the stories that support the idea that armies today, large armies, are very powerful but more constrained than ever. Just think about the Pentagon and the Taliban. Just think about Somali pirates. These are former fishermen in the coast of Somalia that go out on rickety boats and hijack some of the largest ships in the world, tankers and super tankers and cargo ships and passenger ships. And the world has reacted to this by deploying a multilateral flotilla that is one of the most sophisticated ever assembled. And that NATO is there, and the Chinese are there, the Ukrainians and the Turks, and everyone has some of the best ships and the most modern ships plying those waters to try to stop these pirates. Well, they haven't been able to. The pirates continue to hijack day in and day out these very big ships. The same is happening in politics. What we are seeing around the world, especially in democracy, well, first, it's happening in politics everywhere. It's happening in politics in the world of tyrants and autocrats. It's becoming much less safe. And the numbers show it. We have now the largest number of humans living in democracies ever in history. And that does not include China. So that tells you more than 50% of humanity lives in regimes where they have elected their leaders. In 1990, only in 1990, 69 nations were non-democracies, were not free. Today, we have 69 in 1990 were democracies. Now the number is 117. So the number of democracies has skyrocketed. And you have seen the Arab Spring, you have seen all kinds of pressures and difficulties that tyrants and authoritarian governments have to stay in power. But we have also seen in democracies a greater difficulty of delivering. And a lot of countries have now democracies that have become Italian. By that I mean democracies that cannot deliver with the effectiveness and the timeliness, the kind of decisions, the kind of public policies that are necessary. They get diluted, postponed, blocked, and so on. Frank Fukuyama, a very distinguished professor, has coined a concept called vetocracies for these democracies. These are veto centers, where these are systems where people, individuals, but organizations, political parties have the ability to block, derail, postpone, distort the decisions of others. So everyone has just enough power to veto, to block others, but no one has enough power to push through a mandate, an agenda. And you see it in Washington today, and you know about the sequester and the fiscal cliff, and now we have a threat that come September, there is a risk that they're going to defund the operations of the United States government. And we're talking about one of the most mature and sophisticated democracies in the world, and there you have it. So imagine what else is going on around the world. 30 out of the 34 democracies that are members of the OECD, which is the group of countries that are the wealthiest in the world, 30 of them have a situation in which the chief executive, the president, the head of state, is from one party, and the Congress or Parliament is controlled by a different party. And therefore, and sometimes more than one. So you see all these unwieldy alliances and very difficult coalitions that have to be built in order to govern. And that is just an example of what's happening in terms of gridlock and postponement and the dilution of the quality of decisions. In the military, the same thing is happening. I already mentioned the Somali pirates, but you are seeing the proliferation of individuals and groups that have access to military hardware that in the past were just reserved for the state. The debate about drones that we now have in the United States and about the legality of the United States using drones to target kill people around the world is going to be, very soon, is going to be displaced by the debate about the fact that everyone will have drones. That a lot of countries and groups and individuals can have a drone. They are becoming very inexpensive. And therefore, the most important weapon of the 21st century, that is the improvised explosive device, which is the weapon that has caused the largest number of casualties, is going to move from the subsoil to the skies. Because groups that have drones can now use the drones for their purposes. So imagine the national debate about drones when that becomes common. And that is another example of how a proliferation of small actors that I call micropowers are beginning to constrain the ability of the largest established mega players to do whatever they want. I'm not suggesting that terrorists or criminal organizations or small groups of bandits are going to defeat and overwhelm the Pentagon or the US military. I am going to argue that they are going to constrain the options that traditionally have been taken for granted by the military establishments of the world. So in a lot of these examples, it's not a matter that the micropowers are going to win. The story is one in which the micropowers are going to deny the mega players option that they have always taken for granted. Think about the private sector. Who here hasn't had a Kodak moment? Kodak has gone out of business. Kodak has filed for bankruptcy procedures. Almost at the same time that Kodak was filing for bankruptcy, a small company with a 3 years old small company with 13 employees was sold for $1 billion. And it was on photography. It's called Instagram. And it's an app in your phone. Who would have said that a company that was almost a monopoly, Kodak was almost a monopoly for the 70s and the 60s and the 80s, Kodak dominated photography. And all of a sudden is going out of business, and there's this new app that takes its place. I'm not suggesting that Kodak went down because of Instagram. Kodak went down because of Kodak and its leadership. What I'm suggesting is that it's very interesting to see how these very new, small, agile, different micro players that play with a different playbook are able to constrain and sometimes survive in waves of change that the large corporations cannot survive. Religion. You have all seen the enthusiastic reception that Pope Francis just recently had in Brazil. And it's a revival of the Catholic Church in Latin America. Latin America is a bastion of Catholicism. Well, it so happened that Catholicism has been losing 500,000 Catholics in Brazil for the last 10 years. It just so happens that the fastest growing religions in Latin America, in Africa, in places of Asia like the Philippines, is Pentecostalism and the new evangelical churches that play and relate with their flock in completely different ways. So the global marketplace for souls is being appended by all kinds of newcomers, of micro players that are chipping at the traditional groups that were the supporters and the faithful of the Catholic Church, of the mainstream Protestant Church. I can go on with a lot of other examples. As I said before, and the book is full of examples, I repeat, there is no human endeavor that is not being reshaped by these trends. So the question is then, why? Why is this happening? The initial instinct when you ask that question is technology, of course. More specifically, the internet. Even more specifically, social media. Twitter and Facebook and SMS messages and all of that. Of course, those are very powerful forces, but they're not the main ones. And these are technologies. Technologies they're tools. Tools require users. And users have motivation and direction. So more important than looking at the tools that are amplifying the power of the players, let's look at what drives the players and what are the changes that are allowing the players to have such amplified power, use the amplified power they have to move things in a certain direction. So The list of factors that explain the decay of power and why it's easier to get and harder to use and easier to lose have a lot to do. There's a long list, as I said. But in order to facilitate its presentation, I grouped it in three large categories that I call the revolutions. And I think these are revolutionary changes. These are categories that capture a bunch of revolutionary changes in three different dimensions. One I call the more revolution. The second is the mobility revolution. And the third is the mentality revolution. More, mobility, mentality. The more revolution rather, there I try to capture the fact that we now live in a world of profusion. There is more of everything. Good things and bad things, but there's just more of everything. There is more products and more countries and more companies and more religions and more non-governmental organizations and more media outlets and more political parties and more of everything. And mostly there is more of us. It took us as humanity until 1950 to get to the 2 billion marks in the population. Well, we're now at 7, and we add 2 billions every 20 years. And not only there's more of us, this is the youngest planet that we have ever had. Never before in human history there were so many young people on Earth like now. Unevenly distributed. In Japan, you don't have a lot of young people, or in Europe, or in Russia. But certainly in the rest of the world, the majority of the population is under 30. So, a lot of more humans, a lot of more young humans, and in cities. In 2007, for the first time in history, more people lived in cities than in the rural settings. Urbanization now is at the fastest that we have ever seen. And not only more and younger and cities, but better off than ever. The numbers are staggering. The numbers about human prosperity are quite amazing and surprising. Our GDP per capita today is 5 times larger than it used to be in 1950. In the last, between 2008 and 2010, 125 people per day were lifted out of poverty around the world. There is 36 countries, according to the World Bank, have gone from being in the category of poor countries, of low-income countries, have been lifted up to being middle-income countries. So, in the age of profusion, there is also more material well-being for everyone, and there is more education and more caloric intake. People are eating more than ever, and they're better informed than ever. Pick any indicator that traces the human condition and trace it for the last 20 years, and you'll see how that indicator has skyrocketed. These have been the last 2 decades, the best last 2 decades ever in the history of humanity. And the more, what does the more have to do with power? Where the more overwhelms the barriers that shield the powerful. Essentially, to have power, you have to have something unique. You have to have a unique asset that is hard to replicate by those that want to challenge you, by your rivals and competitors. And the more revolution essentially overwhelms the barriers that protect the powerful. And the mobility revolution essentially says that it's not just that we have more of everything, but that more that we have moves more, is far more mobile. More people and more money and more companies and more pandemics and illnesses and more ideologies and more information and more everything is moving more. We have 37% more migrants in the world today than a decade ago. Last year, 1 billion humans visited another country for the first time. So everything is moving, and you know the story about connectivity and about information moving at a much faster speed. You put the more revolution with the mobility revolution together, you shake it, and you get a very profound change in mentality. And that is the mentality revolution. the profound changes in expectations, aspirations, hopes, values, ways of tolerating or not tolerating certain things. The notion, the phrase that we are going to do this way because that's the way it has always been done, has lost power and efficacy and effectiveness at unprecedented rates in presidential palaces and in your dinner conversations. And so the three revolutions are profoundly changing the barriers that shield the powerful, and they are at the core of why this is happening. The interesting questions remain as to, so what? If these trends are true, are they good for us? And are they to be celebrated or not? Well, I think they're very good. I think these trends are very important. As I said, they're profoundly transformational. They're changing the world in very important ways. They're driving a lot of the other changes that you see talked about far more. And this is a world of opportunity. This is a world in which marginal groups and individuals now have a shot. This is a group in which startups and people that have an idea have more ways and more opportunities to finding the capital and the possibility of launching new companies. This is a world in which activists can imagine overthrowing long-entrenched, untouchable dictators. This is a group where women in Pakistan are beginning to find a way of demanding rights to be educated. This is a world of opportunity, of possibility. This is a much better world. But it also has a downside. And the downside, and we can discuss it now in your questions and answers, the downside has a lot to do with politics. It has to do with the emergence and the proliferation of vetocracies, and this inability of democracies to deliver at the speed and the quality of policy making that we are demanding. Let me stop there and invite your questions and comments. Thank you. Yes.
Wow. What? The mic. What do you see as the most significant driver of real, enduring, positive change?
The human spirit. The human spirit. There's a lot that's going on that essentially you can trace to very basic human instincts that are now more have more opportunities to be expressed. What you see in Syria, of people going out day in and day out in the streets knowing that they're going to be shot at, and they still continue to go in, and with all the complications we know. But what does that tell you about the human spirit and about the hunger for certain very basic values that, in fact, I think are deeply wired into us? I think the value of liberty is deeply wired in us.
You define power as the ability to direct or prevent the current or future actions of other groups and individuals, basically what it comes down to. And you talk about power being the degeneration, or is it the degradation of power, right? So
that's the definition.
Right,
Thank you. Yeah.
Right, and so I think what you're trying to say is maybe the whole definition is power is now going back to something that's more, that doesn't change. For example, the examples of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, the moral examples that inspire people to, react to their higher angels.
Right.
Could you maybe comment a little bit on this idea of moral power or soft
That's a
power?
great question, of course. No, that's a very good question. So that's the definition I give in the book. The power is the ability to make others do or not do something. And that's the standard classic definition. And then the question is, is it my argument on the decay of power that we need to change the definition of power? And no. The definition of power continues to be that, and power continues to be the coin of the realm in a lot of places. In no way I am arguing that power is disappearing. In fact, the correct title for the book would have been The End of Power as We Know It. But power still exists. And of course, power has had in history and continues to have today the very important moral dimension, the Gandhi and Mandela type, the older Mandela type of behavior that continues to be with us. And also, like the other kind of power, has been amplified by technology. So people that exert that kind of power now have more options to deploy it.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It's great. I wonder if you've had the opportunity to reflect, or whether you can comment on sort of post-democracy systems of government and organization that might reflect this new pluralism and, you know, sort of everything that you've just been discussing.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. Yeah, that's the last part of the book, which is the big "so what," addresses that question and tries to answer that question. That is a very thorny question. I'm very humble about prescriptions. I don't want to pretend that I have 5 bullet, a PowerPoint presentation that says, and therefore the implications of what I'm saying are these 5 behaviors that I recommend. I don't have that. But I do have one area of concern, which is about politics. And how do we do something to prevent the further Italianization of democratic politics around the world? And there, in answer to your question, I give a lot of attention to something that, unless I bring it up in conversation like this, it's never brought up. And that is political parties. I think we need, let me tell you an exercise I always do when I talk to college students. I tell them, listen, there is this butterfly in Indonesia that is at risk of becoming extinct. How many of you would like to join me in going to try to save this butterfly in Indonesia? Let's create a non-governmental organization that does that. Inevitably, a lot of hands, people want to do good and they are committed and engaged and want to change the world. Then I explain, listen, I don't know anything about butterfly. That was just an example. I made it up. I just wanted to see how many of you were willing to engage. But I have another invitation for you. Why don't you join me in going to a political party? Let's pick one and let's join a political party. And they run for the exits. That is my way of explaining why, in the last 20 years, political parties have had a terrible, horrible run. And non-governmental organizations have had a wonderful run. Anyone that is an idealist, that wants to change the world of its community or its country or help others elsewhere, joins an NGO, a non-governmental organizations. They don't think of political parties as instruments to improve the human conditions, to improve the world. And for good reasons. Political parties have been not good. And they have been, after the end of the Cold War, they have not delivered. They have been beset by corruption, by all kinds of accusations, many of which are correct. But we need them. There is no democracy based on movements, on NGOs that are very often are single-minded, single issue. You saw what happened with the Occupy Wall Street movement and with others. So these are very disruptive movements that are very good at disrupting, but they're very bad at governing. The ones that are bad at disrupting but better at governing are political parties. So we need to bring innovation to the world of politics, and especially to the world of political parties. And that's the hope.
Yes. With the dispersion of power and the Italianization of politics, is there now a risk of totalitarianism?
No. The risk is there. It will be foolish to deny it. But as I said, the forces that make authoritarianism less safe are very powerful. If you think about a country, which country do you think is more exposed to the 3 revolutions? China. If you think about what's going on in Egypt, think about the Arab Spring in the context of the 3 revolutions, and you see them in spades. And so, yes, we will always have authoritarian propensities, but life is getting harder for them. Just think about all the efforts that Vladimir Putin has been doing to present his government and himself as a democrat. He has a prime minister, and then he turns over, then he has elections, but the elections are rigged. And why Vladimir Putin doesn't say, I'm it. Let's stop pretending. Let's stop having elections. Let's stop Medvedev for pretending that he's running things. Everybody knows that I'm running things. So let's just be frank here. I am running this country. Why he doesn't do that? Because the seal of good housekeeping of being a democracy is becoming indispensable in today's world. And that is a very good omen.
Hola, Moises. Most people say when there is a change from totalitarianism or authoritarianism that it's going to take 2 generations before you get to some sort of a balanced democracy. Does your vision of the world today shorten that period, or are we going to look at, the ups and downs and dives and corruptions and everything else?
That's another great question. I don't know the answer to that. What I know is that there is more unpredictability because of the innovations that I see coming. You see, think about what you did today and what you're going to do the rest of today. And think about the innovations that are going to touch the way you behave today. The way you eat, the way you buy, the way you date, almost everything we do every day has been touched and transformed, sometimes disruptively, by technology and by innovation. Everything. Except the way we govern ourselves. In the last 20 years, everything has been appended and transformed by technology and innovation, except politics. We really haven't had great innovations in politics. And I believe that a wave of innovations in politics is coming, a very important one. And it's being driven by the hunger that all of us have for better government and better politics, and by the supply of new technologies and new ways of doing things. The convergence of the demand and supply for innovation in politics is going to create a political world like we have not seen before. And that is why it's so hard to predict if there's going to be a shortening of the process you mentioned.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take a bottle. You want some water?